Hi, this is Jay Faulkner. I'm an open source developer with G-Research open source software, a longtime maintainer on Ironic, and you might also know me as the host of the gr-oss podcast. But I'm here today to talk to you about Ironic a little bit. With Ironic, we just completed the PTG for the 2025.2 Flamingo cycle, where we're planning out all the stuff we're going to be doing over the next 6 months. So what I wanted to do was to give everyone a quick video summary of what was discussed at the PTG, what work items were completed in Epoxy, and what things are planned for Flamingo. As always, I'll have all of the primary sources for this, including the email to the mailing list, the project work items document, and the PTG Etherpad linked in the description below so that you can click and follow along yourself. But first, we've got to start off with 2025.1. We always start off PTGs with a retrospective where we have to ask, what did we get done? Why did we maybe not get everything done? Or did we get more done than we expected? And there's an obvious input here of we've got to know what didn't get done so that we can know what to do next. But also in this case, there's a value in this process of like trying to figure out what's wrong with the development process, if there's anything we can fix, what our capacity looks like for next cycle. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through the high level 2025.1 work items. That's for the Epoxy release that just came. I'm going to say a few words about them. Most of them are going to be completed or are going to have some reason why they weren't completed. So we were talking about Redfish console support. This has actually landed. Steve Baker did a really great job on this. It's a little bit more complicated than it seems like it should need to be because so many Redfish consoles are exposed as a web interface. We're actually having to have a whole lot of machinery in Ironic to spin up containers with web browsers inside that we're remotely controlling and then exposing over VNC. So it's just another case of Ironic sort of doing whatever's needed, jumping through whatever hoops are required by the hardware in order to get you, what you need. But that is shipped. Supporting OCI as a container for image files is shipped as well. That's available in the Epoxy release. And the fun bit about this is if you're using Ironic standalone, using it with Metal Cubed, if you're using it sort of without Glance installed, then we already had a few pieces of support here. You could put in a plain HTTP URL and we go download that. But it's pretty clear at this point that most people who are big enough or at scale enough to be running an OpenStack or a standalone Ironic are also likely using containers somewhere in their ecosystem and have a container registry. So this is just another place where Ironic can now plug in and become a part of other ecosystems and not just OpenStack. And that's really exciting and a pattern I hope we see spreading across more projects. The way this works technically is kind of cool. There's a manifest. That manifest can talk about what's inside it. And one of those things that you can have inside an OCI manifest is saying, hey, I've got a disk file. I've got a QCal2 image that you can use. And that's kind of how Ironic is supporting it. We're going in, we're looking in the artifact for something configured as a disk image, and then we're applying that. The other thing, and this is kind of related, supporting container-based deployment via bootc. So bootc is not something I'd heard about at all until the PTG last year, but it's a tool that you can have bootc inside a container, and then when you run it, it's going to actually install the container onto the operating system, onto the hardware. So it's kind of weird because, like I said, it's like Ironic is coordinating bootc doing an install more or less, but the end result you get is you can use Ironic to do the deployment and you get a machine at the end that's got an OS tree style distribution set up based on that container we installed. And as I understand it, bootc has lots of hooks that you can do things like upgrade, and it'll, put a new container in the other side of the OS tree and flip you over on a reboot, that sort of stuff. So this sounds really cool. It's not a technology I'm personally aware of, but again, it's kind of, we can put the pieces together. It's pretty cool. Networking Project Mercury. This one's actually on our list for next time. During Epoxy, we just talked about kind of talking about it some more, trying to get a more formal working group up, get more discussions started. And I think we did that pretty successfully, but we'll talk about what's in scope for next cycle when we get there. Inspection hooks for out-of-band inspection. So this is sort of deceptive because it doesn't include inspector migration on this list, and really that was one of the big things with the inspection we completed last cycle, was getting the inspector completely migrated. So That is pretty exciting, but that is, we do have a lot of those inspection hooks hooked up now where you can use them even if you're using out-of-band inspections. So that's nice. Now we're reaching sort of stuff that didn't ship in epoxy, and we'll talk a little bit about why. We did some research into a Kia DHCP backend. That work was actually deprioritized in favor of getting more hands working on the inspector migration. We thought it was extremely important that by the end of the 2025.1 cycle that we could complete the inspector migration, and that was kind of deemed more important than Kia DHCP backend. But another piece of context with this is during the last cycle, we also had the major bugs in DNS masks that were impacting us fixed by them, which removed a lot of the urgent time pressure onto this task that it originally had. For M-band disencryption, this is still in process, but it's being championed by a part-time contributor, someone who's not always in the Ironic community, and just didn't get quite done. It can be tough to get these big projects done if you don't have a huge chunk of time to dedicate to it, but we're hoping to see that come back around, even though we didn't commit to picking that back up for the Flamingo cycle, because like I said, we're really not sure when it's going to get done, even though it's still getting worked on. Container-based IPA steps. So this is in a weird middle ground of it landed, but it landed shortly after the release was done. So while, we're you sitting here watching this video, the container-based IPA steps is complete, it's ready, it's in head of our master branch right now. However, it was one of the earliest things committed into Flamingo, so you're not actually going to get that until Flamingo. But it's in there, it's supported, and I bet you could probably just run an IPA with that commit against an existing Ironic and get the behavior you need as long as you configured it all locally. But you didn't hear that from me, and we wouldn't support that upstream. But it's pretty simple, pretty cool stuff, a hardware manager. So improve OEM handling in Sushi. This is, to give you a little bit of context, Sushi is the library that the Ironic team maintains to talk to Redfish BMCs. Sushi is a pretty big part of Ironic, really. And OEM is sort of the part of Redfish when we talk about things that are vendor specific, that might fall outside of the standard or quirks handling for different hardware vendors. And what we've done is we took the Sushi OEM DRAC project, which had been a separate sort of plugin you could put into Sushi to make it work better for Drax. And we've integrated that into Sushi and have sort of paved the road for more Quarks-based stuff directly in Sushi. Quite frankly, a lot of the stuff was designed around the time when we were envisioning an ecosystem of hardware vendors maintaining their own plugins for these things. That's not really come to life. And so as a result, we're going to make it easier for ourselves and mix everything in together. So next up is talking about supporting for NCSI hardware. Now, this is one of those things, when you're an Ironic developer, you sometimes just have to trust that crazy hardware exists that people tell you about. And NCSI is essentially a way to have network cards that have independent power, but they're unable to be powered on and off independently. So what this means is that Ironic needs to have the ability to know that that computer can never be powered off, to know that that server on that BMC that it's talking to can never be powered off. And so we've added that support in where if you set up a node properly, we will just never power it off. We'll just pass it reboots in order to get the things done we need. That's pretty neat. A few maintenance items. We did get pre-commit linting set up in all Ironic projects. So if you're a contributor to Ironic, you can go ahead and run pre-commit install inside your Git repo and have all of our linters added as pre-commit hooks. So you don't have to wait and see if CI passes or take an extra effort on it. And the last thing that was on our list here, and this was another one that I'm sorry, I skipped over one because I don't want to think about it, quite frankly. I suspect the tiny core alternative for the IPA RAM disk. This is one that I personally dedicated at least a couple weeks to last cycle, if not more. And the plan originally was I was going to get Gen 2 support working in Disk Image Builder. That's there, it's working. And then use that support to make a slimmed down RAM disk using sort of the tooling that Gen 2 gives you to uninstall stuff you don't need. Well, it turns out a lot of the reason our tiny core Linux RAM disk is small isn't anything inherent to the tiny core distribution, so much as our build process of it, where we strip out a lot of unnecessary things and just really get it down to the absolute bare minimum. So this didn't get completed. We did research. It became very clear that the path we were going down was not going to lead to a RAM disk as small as that tiny core one that we use for CI. And we really don't know what the path forward is for that. That was not picked up for next cycle. We're just going to have to take some sort of new approach with maybe more embedded facing tools. I'm not really sure, but again, this is a CI problem. The only reason this RAM disk exists is because we are testing in virtual machines that are running inside of virtual machines and have very, very little memory. In the real world, most people use larger RAM disks because their servers have huge amounts of RAM and it's not a big deal. So, just sort of a CI problem, and those things sort of get prioritized based on how much pain they're currently causing. And this one definitely checked the box for more painful than it looked. And so it's getting pushed out. And quite frankly, I don't know when it's going to get picked back up. And the last one, another internal one, but this one did get done. This is an exciting thing, is we're retiring Ironic lib. So Ironic lib was an internal library that Ironic created a long time ago, back when we had drivers that sometimes would have the disk partitioning happening on the conductor to like a shared drive or paths like that. So there was a large amount of code shared between Ironic Python agent and Ironic, all the stuff around partitioning, how to understand disks, how to understand certain pieces of hardware, things like that. But what happened is, now that those drivers no longer really exist in the conductor, that if we're going to perform partitioning on a disk, it's going to be done by a remote agent like IPA. That meant that Ironic lib basically had metrics and it had a few shared utility items, which just was not worth the pain, because having a library that two things share, it means, if there's a security update that touches the library, we've got to go patch the library, push it up before we can patch the others. When we're releasing, we have to think about it. We have to coordinate changes. It just became a thing where the pain of having a separate library began to outweigh the value. And so we went ahead, we pulled back. That library's gone. It served us very well, being a library we used for several years. This shouldn't impact any users, though, with two exceptions, and I'm going to say this out loud. First of all is, if you ignored the giant warning at the top of the README of Ironic lib and used it anyway, because we warned people, hey, this is an internal implementation detail of Ironic. We don't promise any API. Then, hey, Ironic lib's never going to be updated. The repository's been retired. If you go check out the tip of the branch right now, you're going to see that it's just a README saying that it's retired. So if you've somehow integrated this downstream against the upstream Ironic wishes, we probably broke you. Similarly goes probably if you've got some patches, this might be a tougher release to rebase them up across. Even more reason to come have a chat with me or someone else upstream about getting your features there. But the other people that need to care about this are people who have forked kind of internally. If you're building your own packages of Ironic, if you have patched versions of things, you've got to make certain that after the point of Epoxy, you're not installing Ironic lib in those virtual environments anymore. I'm not saying it will break stuff. I'm not saying it won't, but it certainly is not a situation you want. And in fact, we have a similar case with Sushi OEM DRAC, where you're not going to want to have Sushi OEM DRAC installed in your virtual machines when you upgrade to this release, because we've completely gotten rid of it at this point. So that's sort of the backwards looking. That's looking at the things we completed for Epoxy. A lot of good stories, a lot of cool things we got done, a few things we weren't able to get done. But, we learned a lot of lessons along those paths. But let's have a look at the work items for 2025.2. And again, these documents that I'm going through here, they are upstream, specs.openstack.org. Just click on bare metal specifications and then find the project priorities right there. And they will be linked in the description. But let's talk about the stuff that we talked about in 2025.2. We have a few work items that we've committed to, and we'll talk about them a little bit. The eventlet migration. So I can give a little bit of context here. I actually just wrote a blog post about this. So if you want to search for the Invisible Work of OpenStack blog on the eventlet migration, kind of 1 year later, we talk about the status of this a little bit. But essentially, Eventlet is an old foundational library for OpenStack that was state of the art when OpenStack started. And we used it. Great reasons for using it. It's great, good piece of software that served us well for a long time. But it's a venting model, kind of using implicit asynchronicity and combining that with the fact that it actually patches itself in and replaces some Python standard library modules, makes it where this isn't really an ideal library for the modern Python world. And even beyond that, we're finding that as we get further and further down the path of new Python releases, that it becomes more and more difficult to keep Eventlet compatible. And in fact, I think they're still fixing issues with that related to Python 3.13 right now. So the clock is set. The entire OpenStack project has this as a goal. And the Oslo libraries that we all share to do common things like logging and configuration and stuff are actually deprecating their support for Eventlet and will remove it in the 2026.2 release. So as a project team, we have an 18-month timer that's already started to get all of our uses of Eventlet completely removed. We have had some sort of research proof of concept level work in this area on Ironic, but we always kept hitting a wall. What we sort of figured out was that there was a flawed assumption that the Ironic Python agent might be a really simple example of this to migrate. But in fact, it's sort of a pathological example because for IPA, as well as our other Ironic services, we found out we have a weird protocol where we're actually spinning up a WSGI server late in the startup process. We're doing some pre-configuration. We're doing some setup before we're ready for that WSGI server to start. And that's very different from some projects where the WSGI server is the entry point. So we're figuring that out. Don't know how we're going to solve it yet. If I did, it probably wouldn't need to be on this list and it would just be done. But we're going to figure it out and we're going to get it done. The second thing on this list is probably the feature that I'm the most excited about on the work items for this release, and that's networking. Network port scheduling and dynamic work port groups. So what does this mean? Well, essentially right now, there's two limitations in Ironic. There's not a huge amount of support in Ironic for being able to map ports into networks. You kind of do that a little bit with the physical network tag today. The other one is that port groups themselves are statically configured. In Ironic, we treat a port group today almost like it's a part of the hardware, where like the hardware itself is exposing a port group. And this makes a lot of sense in a world where Ironic was written and, maybe there was not awareness of port groups up and down the stack, which is still kind of the case today. Maybe people have these things statically bonded forever and Ironic's just flipping VLANs or being used in flat. Port groups make perfect sense if you're using it that way, having them be static. But what we were finding is that people who have a fully set up integrated Ironic with Neutron and sort of all the trimmings, what you end up with is a situation where, let's say I have, 6 ports on a server, usually do 2 ports a network across 3 networks. But for some reason, I don't need network 3. I don't need that third network, but I don't want those ports to sit unused. Well, what we want to add is support for sort of being able to set up some rules in Ironic around how we should decide to combine ports into port groups and be able to do that on the fly. So that in the case of that example, when someone did that provisioning, Ironic would be able to look and say, okay, well, we would put these 2 ports in a port group together on network 3 if it existed, but we don't have an ask for network 3. And so now instead, we're going to go bond them into network 2 with the ports of network 2 and creates a port group on the fly. It's pretty cool. And I'm probably doing a pretty bad job of explaining it. You can see there's a link on the screen right now. You can go click it when you go look at this yourself and read up on the spec. If you're someone who thinks you might want to use this feature, now is the time to go and look at the spec and make sure it meets your needs. And if it doesn't, let's have a conversation and try to see if we can make it meet your needs, because this is going to be sort of the foundation for a lot of cool new networking stuff we're doing. All right, so another networking item, and we talked about this a little bit in the retrospective portion, is Project Mercury. So Project Mercury, we talked about it before, is sort of this idea of empowering Ironic to use tools like networking generic switch, which today are used by Neutron to configure physical switches. Even though it's an Ironic project, we want to kind of be able to cut Neutron out of that loop for a simpler environment which doesn't need a Neutron. And that's what Project Mercury is all about, is trying to bring some of those advanced networking features. Honestly, I say advanced networking features, but really at this point in time, I think most people consider being able to switch a port between VLANs as sort of a basic feature, right? So if you even need that in standalone Ironic today, you can't really get it unless you're also installing a Neutron. So this is hopefully going to start empowering standalone users to be able to do some network changing with the new Mercury-based networking interface. If it sounds like I'm not sure what this looks like, that's because we're not sure what it looks like yet. And this is something that's sort of been in our minds for a year plus, but I think we might actually have the first code heading in that direction this cycle, which will be exciting. Another carryover one here is the improved OEM handling in Sushi. A lot of the effort last cycle went to deprecating out Sushi OEM DRAC. And so now we've sort of got to build back up. We've got to build up the capabilities in Sushi to do better OEM and quirks handling. And that's going to get looked at. I think this is going to be a theme, even if maybe not this exact item, over the coming months. Not just this cycle is, I guess, maybe the better way. Our cycle's last month, but not just this cycle, but it'll be a growing concern as we move on and more things are capable to be done through Redfish. And there's more and more value to using a Redfish-centered cleaning process than an agent-based cleaning process, but we got to get there. Another repeat item here is the API response schema validation and Open API spec. So there's an OpenStack-wide project to get people to be able to have an open API schema. If that doesn't sound familiar to you like it didn't to me, that's what they call Swagger now. So if you've seen Swagger layouts of people's APIs, Swagger documentation for APIs, when we say open API spec, you can sort of envision that in your head a little bit. It's in that ballpark of things. Well, last cycle, Adam actually used AI tooling to great success to generate a large number of tests in Ironic Tempest plugin, which verify that microversion handling is done properly. Those are still pending merge, but they've been completely written at this point, just minor pieces of feedback remaining. And once those are merged, then we're actually going to go in and we'll start changing the way we do the schemas, since we're going to have a little bit of CI backstopping us to keep us from making an egregious mistake. All right, Redfish-based servicing improvements. This is an interesting one. It's sort of a weird side effect of the way some of our features interact to provide a non-ideal experience. So I'll give you a concrete example of firmware update. Today, if you do a firmware update, we use the agent to know that the machine is back up. So we do a firmware update and we boot an agent on the machine when we believe it's done. And the fact that the agent itself is booted indicates to us that the machine is done. It's not it's not rebooting still to do firmware updates, and that it's actually booted into an OS, which to us is the number one sign we can move on. But this has the downside of, otherwise, if you're doing a Redfish-based firmware update, it's completely out of band. So we need to figure out a way when we're performing Redfish-based activities to be able to set it up so that people have to use the agent less, because that's always what takes the longest with these servers is posting, getting them booted up. It takes a real long time. That includes booting up an agent. And depending on how big your agents are, that build time, that time can just get bigger and bigger for booting. So we have this disable Ramdisk flag for servicing. It doesn't really work as the way you would expect, because we still do need to boot an agent for the firmware update. And so Yuri, Jacob, Dimitri, they're all going to go digging down there and see if there's a better way for us to coordinate that, with sort of the goal being the holy grail of being able to perform a firmware update using Redfish and never having to boot an agent on the machine. Again, I don't know if we'll get there. I don't know what the technical challenges will be along the way, but we're going to find out this cycle. And the last one here, this is us trying to find a solution for one of our most commonly requested features. Or I will say that may not be true anymore, but it's probably because we've told all the relevant people no enough that they've stopped asking. But right now, with Ironic cleaning, we can change what steps run based on the hardware. This is super powerful if you have a heterogeneous environment where you might have, lots of different hardware that behaves differently. And, you want to be able to deploy one agent and have it figure out what the hardware needs for you to do. Well, that's awesome, but it has a big downside in that we can't predict what steps are going to be running cleaning unless we're actually running an agent. And so our users have asked us for a long time for a way for them to ask the API, when node X cleans, what steps will it run? And that's just not a question we can answer without booting a RAM disk. Obviously not going to do that. So what came up was an idea to actually document it after the fact in node history. So we've added an item to our work items. What we're going to do with this is we're just going to, at the beginning of cleaning, we're going to put in an event type saying that cleaning's begun. We're going to say what steps we expect to run. And then at the end of cleaning, we'll say cleaning was successful or cleaning failed, which cleaning failed kind of already happens anyway. We tried to run these steps, or we did successfully run these steps. And so that way, if you're developing against a new piece of hardware, you can get something that's readily accessible via the API telling you what's actually happening, in addition to the ability to, after the fact, audit it, to be able to go ask node history, when was this server's disk last wiped? Or when do we think Ironic wiped the disk last? So that's pretty cool. So a couple of caveats here, a couple of things I always like to point out is we're all people with a huge amount of stuff on our calendars, on our plates. A lot of our developers are working on other projects as well. I mean, half of the names on this list are Metal Cube contributors, for instance. A lot of us contribute to other OpenStack projects. There's just a lot of things on everyone's plate. And so there's a reason we call this work items instead of using an item like priorities or roadmap or things like that. And it's because these are the things we want to work on. These are the things we think are the most important right now at the beginning of the 6 months. The end of the 6-month cycle, these may not be the most important things anymore. And as you saw, some of the things dropped off the list from last time. Some of the things may drop off of this list, but this gives you an insight into what we're thinking is most important, what we're thinking we can get done next cycle. And if you want to have input into this list, then, it's a little bit late for this cycle, but what you need to be on the lookout for is we'll start talking about a PTG happening again in another 5.5 months at this point, probably. And you can come to that PTG. If you care enough about Ironic to watch this video, you care enough to be in the PTG. And that includes, maybe you don't have in-depth knowledge about Ironic. That's fine. Come here, tell us what you're doing. Let us try to figure out how to make it better. Because the more conversations we have with the people who run our software, the better off we're going to be able to find and fix the flaws in it that they run across. So thank you for hanging out with me here for about 30 minutes talking about what Ironic talked about in the PTG. Again, to recap, we did a retrospective by looking at the 2025.1 priorities. Then we went and looked at the 2025. See, I said priorities, I meant work items. We went through the 2025.1 work items. We talked about what was done, what didn't get done, the things that kind of got half done. Then we went on to the 2025.2 work items and we talked about what's here and sort of how we expect that to go. I do want to encourage you, please do leave a comment down below. If there's anything here that you're excited about, if maybe there's something that dropped off that you're sad to hear, then let's talk about that too. But as always, you can reach out to us on the mailing list, NIRC, pound OpenStack-Ironic on OFTC, which you can get to through IRC or Matrix. And come join us. And finally, I do want to say, as always, a big thank you to G-Research and G-Research open source software for enabling me as part of my job to bring you this sort of information. It's just one of the ways they're giving back to the open source community. If you want to work for a company that gives back to the open source community and you live in the Dallas, Texas or London, UK areas, then go ahead and head over to gresearch.com/vacancies and look and see what jobs they have open. Maybe you'll be the next person who gets to work with us. I don't know. We'll also have that linked in the description. So for now, I'm Jay Faulkner. Thank you so much for your time and have a pleasant day. Goodbye.